do I tell my child that they have ADHD? And should I tell my child that they have ADHD?
So welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Parenting Understood. We are thrilled today to be speaking with Mallory, Lori, and Katie of the Childhood Collective. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here. So we were thinking that just, before we sort of delve into more of a conversation around ADHD and, sort of the skills and everything that we want to equip our children with, we wanted to hear a little bit about you all and how the Childhood Collective came about, what you do. So that'd be great.
Yeah, so I am Lori and I'm a child psychologist, and this is Katie. She's a speech language pathologist, and Mallory, and she is also a child psychologist. So we have all kind of overlapped a little bit in private practice. Katie and I actually first met nanny sharing with our kids many, many years ago. And we've all kind of worked together, and we do evaluations and we do therapy for kids with, ADHD, autism, learning disorders. And I think all of us kind of found that after our evaluations for ADHD, parents were just really struggling in particular with challenging behaviors and not knowing what to do and feeling overwhelmed. And we saw so many families that would get their first diagnosis from a pediatrician, and they really got the option of, do you want to start meds or do you not want to? And that was about it. And, we know that there are so many behavioral and social and behavioral interventions that families can do alongside medication. Not that medication is a bad option, but a lot of parents don't necessarily want to do that first, or their kids are too young, and maybe their kids are at risk for ADHD, but they don't have a diagnosis. So we really wanted to provide education and courses for families on how to give them interventions and tools and easy, simple strategies that they can use at home to support their kids with ADHD.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think the other piece too is that we were doing therapy more one-on-one and in that kind of individualized setting, and realizing that we're in a big metro area and it's hard even for us, for families to get to us. Obviously they're, having to drive, and there's a lot of different things. And so just providing, that the course that we do have helps a lot with families just being able to access, that information. And then we share obviously in our blog and our social media all about different strategies too.
It's definitely such a great resource that you all provide, considering how long wait lists can be, right? And so to get that information right away to parents who are struggling. So what would you say are the most important skills to teach young children with ADHD?
It's a good question. I think the first and most important thing to teach your child is not necessarily a hard skill, but more of equipping them with an understanding of how their brain works and how it works differently than a lot of the kids in their class. So a concern that we hear from a lot of parents once they've gotten the diagnosis, or maybe they're suspecting their child has ADHD, but they're hesitant to get an evaluation, is how do I tell my child that they have ADHD? And should I tell my child that they have ADHD? And in general, we found that it's really important to, in a developmentally appropriate way, explain to your child what ADHD is, how it affects their brain, because these kids know that they're different. They know that some things are more challenging for them than it is the person sitting next to them in class. They're picking up on these subtleties, and sometimes it's not so subtle. They know that something is different about them, and equipping them with that understanding of, this is why your brain works differently, and it's not bad, it's not wrong, but this is why that's happening. Then that kind of lays the foundation of then being able to do some of those more hard skill building. Now that we know why your brain works this way, this is why these strategies work. This is why we need to work on this specific skill. So kind of you have to lay that foundation and help them understand how their brain works to then actually teach skills.
Absolutely. A lot of what we do too is really educating parents in executive functioning and helping parents understand why their child might be doing something a different way. And sometimes, honestly, as parents, it can be really frustrating. Like when your child is, super messy, disorganized, dysregulated, easily frustrated. And so it's a really helping reframe for parents too, like, this is what's going on kind of at that neurological level. It's not all behavior just for the sake of behavior, right? It's communication. It's letting us know something's going on there and we can help support. But I think that's a huge feedback we get from parents is like, once we reframe that, it really just changes their whole experience in, how they interact with their child.
I love that idea of providing both parents and children this reframing and this understanding of neurologically what's going on as well as behaviorally. I'm just sort of curious. So I come from an early childhood world, for very young children where maybe they don't yet have a diagnosis, but there's a suspicion or they do have a diagnosis, but it's at the very beginning. Sort of how do you work with very young children and families around that where, the children themselves might not quite be ready yet developmentally to accept that information?
Sure. If you're not necessarily putting, an ADHD label on it, but we talk about it how we talk with all kids about we all have strengths and we all have areas of need. And this is really an area where we want to build your skill, or this is something that we're going to practice and focus on a little bit more so that you can feel more confident and you can do things independently. So focusing more on not taking necessarily the ADHD route, but more of the we all have strengths and we all have needs that we can work on with that younger population.
Yeah, and I think in our course, our online course, Creating Calm, we focus a lot on changing the way we interact as parents. And I think for most of us as parents, we know exactly what our kids aren't supposed to be doing all the time. And I think kids with ADHD are kind of constantly getting that feedback because they're, climbing up the walls and they're hitting other kids and they're becoming aggressive. And it feels like as a parent, you're just constantly correcting them all the time. And what we're trying to start out with is look at what skills do we want to be teaching them? Like, what are the things that we want them to be doing? Are we systematically teaching those things on a regular basis and telling them what our expectations are and really providing a lot of praise and teaching and feedback on those behaviors? We don't think about behaviors necessarily as we have to teach this skill just like we teach reading or teach our young kids, our preschool kids, letters and sounds. We have to teach them these behavior skills in the same way. So really having parents kind of step back and look at, we know what we don't want them to be doing. How do we prevent these things from happening by teaching them the skills? And the skills can be very different depending on what the behaviors are that you're dealing with. But again, it's more of focusing on prevention and as a parent, really stepping back and setting up systems at home to really teach those behaviors.
And I think something that you're getting at here, Lori, and especially in the younger years, it's even less skill building with our kids, although that's an important piece, but it's a lot of skill building with our parents. And it's not because they're parenting poorly or they're doing something wrong, but these kids need to be parented in a different way sometimes. So especially in the younger years, a lot of it is building parent skills and helping them learn what works for their child and supports their child. And then there's, of course, skill building to be done directly with the child, but a lot of it rests on the parent. And again, it's not because parents are doing something bad or wrong. They're just the real agents of change in the household.
Do you find sometimes, I'm just thinking more as a parent right now, but sometimes in the moment where it's so hard, right?
Yes.
It's almost sometimes hard to know when you almost need help in a way. At least I find that. So I'm just curious as to what you found, since you have your private practices and you also have your online courses and educational resources, sort of if you think that you've been able to reach maybe a different group of parent or by, allowing folks to sort of do this at their own pace versus actually seeking out specific help at a specific time.
I think absolutely we've been able to reach a lot more families than we would. And there's still, unfortunately, there's still stigma attached to going to therapy, parents and kids. And having this online course, I feel like makes this information a little bit more approachable for parents. They do it in the comfort of their own home, on their own time. And even just the information that we're providing to families, not necessarily through our paid course, but through our blog and on Instagram, it's helping parents. They'll have epiphanies like, oh, I never even put words to that before, but that is a challenge in my home. And also there's this sense of, I'm not the only one experiencing that. And I'm hearing from these other parents that could be better. So it makes it a little bit more approachable in that way too, knowing that you're not the only parent that's going through that. And you're hearing that other parents, that there's something to do about it, that it could be better. So they're a little bit more likely to then reach out for the support.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of what we see is like normalizing the experience. And we hear from parents all the time, like, oh my gosh, I have friends that followed our small Instagram when we were first starting because they were like, you're my friend, I'm going to support you. And then a year later, they're like, do you think my child needs an evaluation? And I'm like, well, those are tricky waters to navigate. But truly, I think a lot of times the things that are hard about parenting, we don't even necessarily have words or a label. Like most people don't have training in early child development. They don't know that, a 2-hour bedtime is probably a symptom of something more significant going on. They're just like, it's just really hard. And so, yeah, I think just, we obviously use some humor, but a lot of science and a lot of research to show kind of like, here's what you can do to support. And I think parents really appreciate it. Like even parents that aren't raising a child with ADHD, but especially that population, it's like, I'm not alone in this.
And there's so many like little things that we know and you take for granted, like as a psychologist, or if you're in early childhood development, like we have like tools and things to help with bedwetting or sleep issues or behavioral challenges. And they're really, they're really simple hacks a lot of the time. And they don't take a ton of effort, but parents just don't know about it. And I think we've just seen an overwhelming response of parents like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea that this was like a thing that I could do. I was struggling for years with it. So anyway, I think that's been really helpful for a lot of families.
Thinking about a parent who has a young child, maybe there's like a family history of ADHD, but there's some resistance, maybe due to stigma, maybe due to lack of resources, or just general anxiety about not knowing what to do. What would you tell that parent in terms of what the diagnosis process looks like, and then what they can anticipate in terms of getting resources, maybe outside of the school support, and then maybe touching a little bit on what school supports also look like?
Yeah, so I do ADHD evaluations and specialize that in my private practice. And I would say the evaluation process for ADHD is really varied. So if you go to a pediatrician to get the diagnosis, pediatricians don't necessarily specialize in ADHD. They're familiar with it. So they might give a rating scale to a parent or a teacher and then just make a diagnosis. And there's not like a lot of recommendations like I talked about earlier. Whereas if you go to a child psychologist or a neuropsychologist, we do pretty in-depth testing. Like I spend, 4 to 8 hours with kids in my office, like doing a variety of tests. And the reason for that is that 80% of kids with ADHD have overlapping diagnoses with other types of things. So it might be a speech language disorder, dyslexia, like a reading disorder, dysgraphia, writing disorder, anxiety, depression, autism. And so because of that high overlap with other diagnoses, it really is important to get a thorough evaluation. And so the process can look like an interview with a parent, us working with the kids, maybe doing IQ testing or academic testing, or if your child is having reading issues, we're going to do more in-depth testing related to phonological awareness and phonological processing, neuropsych testing related to attention and executive functioning. Katie has all kinds of tests related to
more on the language side,
yes,
and social skills that can be impacted and that sort of thing. But typically, I think the big picture for parents when they're walking through that diagnostic process is that getting the answers can be incredibly helpful. So once after Lori works with the child and she writes a report and meets with them, or if it's language and psychology, we might write that report together. It's really like sitting down with them and helping them see like their child is the same child that it was, right? Like your child's not different now. It's just that you have a better understanding of what's going on and how to support. I really, when she says that about like the pediatrician versus a psychologist, I can't recommend that enough. I just feel like so many times parents come, especially to me, I think speech is easier for parents sometimes to be like, well, child needs language therapy, seems easier than like a big scary label. And then I see them and it's like, oh, the pediatrician said ADHD, and that's not necessarily incorrect, but it's like, oh my gosh, this child is struggling academically. There's so many things. So I'm always pushing them back like, oh, let's do psychology testing too. And I think it is so scary as parents. Like, I know I'm working on getting an eval for one of my children right now, and it's very scary. It's intimidating, even knowing what I know and knowing the process. But I think it's really important. So just encouraging families, like it doesn't change who your child is. It's giving them clarity and you clarity and a plan.
And I think a lot of families are really worried about a label. Like I was just talking to a mom the other day, and the thought of getting a label of ADHD or autism feels so scary and overwhelming. And how are people going to react to that? Are they going to treat my child differently? Right. And I do think, from what I have seen working with families over the years, and I totally get that, I understand that, and I feel the same way, is that kids get labels regardless. And so if they're in school, they're getting the label from a teacher that they're a bad kid, or that they're lazy and unmotivated, or they're stupid, or they're putting those labels on themselves because they don't understand. So labels are sometimes inevitable, and I'd rather have an accurate label of what's going on so they have a clear understanding of that, than something that really isn't accurate, like I'm stupid or I'm bad or those types of things. And the diagnosis helps us to identify what treatments are most effective. That's really why we do it, and opens up resources for families in the community and at school to really support families. So when we do, again, at the end of that evaluation, you get a diagnosis, but you also have like a clear plan. You should have a clear plan of these are the things that I'm going to do next. Like when I finish a meeting, I want parents to have like 3 things that they do. And I might give them lots of recommendations, but like, these are the things you do right now. At school with ADHD, it's very, very tricky. We just did a whole workshop on this because it's one of the most confusing things. And schools don't diagnose ADHD. I think that's pretty common across our country, that they're not going to get that. It's a medical diagnosis. However, so many kids at school have ADHD, and schools really are required to seek out and identify those kids, even if they're not saying they have ADHD, but like they're showing those symptoms, we need to give them support. So yeah, it can be really confusing because they're not diagnosing a medical diagnosis like ADHD at school.
Yeah. I would love to hear more about this workshop. You mentioned a workshop, and kind of talk us through the structure and what information you're providing to parents. Because wow, what a necessary and really important tool to give parents.
So our goal with hosting the school workshop that we did last month, and we plan to do again this fall, is helping parents understand the school process and some of the nitty-gritty, the law. In addition to helping them kind of figure out what level of support does my child need and what can supports look like at school. And I think this is where hesitancy for parents comes in too, is what good is an evaluation going to do at school, because they don't know what can come from that. Like what supports are available to their child. What would the school do anyway if my kid has an IEP or a 504? Like what supports does that come with? So we wanted to also help parents understand how we can support kids at school. What are evidence-based interventions, tools, strategies, accommodations that could come if your child does qualify for an IEP, an individualized education plan, or a 504 plan. And then also giving them tools and strategies to work with the school as a team. So those were like our overarching goals of hosting this workshop. And we really saw it came from this need from parents reaching out to us. My kid doesn't qualify for an IEP. Is that bad? What is an IEP? messages from families daily about their kids struggling at school, recess getting taken away, getting suspended from school.
And I think for us, even we go to IEP meetings all the time. Across the state, you know, Katie and I still go to IEP meetings, and we know the law really well. And we're sitting there like having to argue for these families to get supports, because the teams really don't even understand the law for kids with ADHD sometimes. We talk about the Office of Civil Rights came out with a letter called the Dear Colleague letter a few years back, because there were thousands of complaints from families of kids with ADHD that their rights were being violated so commonly in schools, and said, schools, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and laid out all of these things that they should be doing. And it still continues to this day. And so we want parents to know, these are your rights. These are the things that should be happening. And these are the legal steps that you can take if you're seeing that they're not doing those things too, to really empower families, because it can feel very isolating when you're sitting in a meeting with 10 people telling you, no, you can't, this is not going to work, even though you feel like, wait, I know that this is the case. Like, I know my child needs supports.
And I think that one of the reasons that families are facing such an uphill battle in the school is because ADHD myths are just perpetuated in the school system. Only boys can have ADHD. So of course that's not accurate. If they just tried a little harder, a lot of times kids with ADHD are very smart, and teachers see that if they just apply themselves, they can do it. It's not about not knowing it. So the feeling from the school is, if they just tried a little harder, it's fine. They don't need an individualized plan. They just need to try harder, or they're lazy, or they're unmotivated. So those perpetuated myths about ADHD are having a big impact on kids at school. And there was something else I was going to say about that that's escaped my brain.
Well, I was going to jump in really quick while you think of it.
Yeah.
But another thing that we really focused on with the families was like what kind of accommodations you can ask for with ADHD. And I think parents are like, my kid needs accommodations. What do I do? And the school, oftentimes I'm in IEPs, and they'll ask the parents, like, well, what do you think would be good accommodations? Which I think is a beautiful question. And I'm really excited to hear that. But the parents are like a little bit deer in headlights. Like, I'm not sure what my options are. So we went through like different types of accommodations, and, you know, you could ask for like, you know, a different workspace, or there's so many options. I just don't think parents would even realize that. And so that's what mostly the feedback we got was like, I was in a meeting, I asked for testing, they told me no, I knew what my rights were, I knew how to respond, and then knowing like what accommodations, you know, they can ask for. And obviously we're giving a list of 100 things and saying, your kid probably doesn't need all of these, but it's nice to have that in their back pocket and understand what those options might be.
And I thought of the other thing I was going to say. We asked our audience a couple weeks ago. We have a lot of teachers that follow us, and we truly believe that teachers, especially in this day and age, are doing the best they can with the information that they have. And we asked our followers, teachers, how many of you have specialized training in ADHD? Was it included in your university training? And we got a lot of responses, and not a single person had training in ADHD. A lot of them had gone and sought out their own information about ADHD. A lot of them because they have kids with ADHD. That's part of the reason they're following us. But there's just a lack of understanding about what ADHD really is. Again, coming back to those myths. And so all of these teachers sending us messages saying, I had absolutely no training in it. So how do we expect them to support an ADHD child in their classroom when they don't truly understand what it even is? How do you know how to help them if you don't know what it is? You can't solve a problem you don't understand.
And parents don't know. They assume that teachers have that training, right?
Yeah.
And so really it's just, they don't understand. And so they really do need that help and support and understanding their child.
What a wonderful resource.
Thank you.
What a wonderful resource to provide to families. You know, so I was talking to a girlfriend, she's a school psychologist here in SoCal, and she was saying in this particular area is very litigious. And it made me think of, I think, Lori, you had mentioned how a lot of the schools weren't providing these supports properly in the IEP process. And I thought to myself, well, this is why it's so litigious, is because parents feel like their children are not getting the resources that they need. And I'm sure that that's probably true across this entire country.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just talking to a family recently, and their child had all the symptoms of ADHD, very hyperactive, couldn't focus. They were in reading intervention. They couldn't focus. They were going to take them out of reading intervention because they didn't feel like it was beneficial, only because of the focus. And the mom had gone to the school and said, I want testing done. So they were supposed to open a file. And then they were just like, oh, we're just going to not do testing because we don't think they need it. They didn't meet with the parent. They just decided that on their own. And then the next thing, they're suggesting that they be retained or held back a grade. So again, the schools are recommending things that are not science-based. Grade retention is not a science-based intervention. And not evaluating when there are clear signs that a child needs support and is really struggling both academically and behaviorally.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of schools out there that are doing a lot of good work too. So we want to make sure and say that, because I think that's so important. I know, working in the field, it is hard and there's so many different nuances to this, but definitely I think more and more parents are feeling empowered to understand their own rights and not just come to the table and say, all right, tell me what I need to know, but they're really wanting to educate themselves. And so our goal is to just put those resources there for them and support them as much as we can, so that they feel confident and they can feel really empowered to go into that meeting and navigate. And maybe it goes great, but they're prepared.
I think that point about empowering parents is so important. I do a lot of work with teachers, and something that so many teachers say all the time is, I wish I knew more about ADHD. I wish I had gotten this in my schooling. I wish there were more professional developments around it. But they were saying, until they're able to get some of those resources, having parents come to them with concrete suggestions of what they can do is the most helpful thing. But they sometimes worry that parents are afraid to come to them because of this fear still of stigmatization. So
yes, absolutely. And it goes all the directions, right? Like the teachers are probably worried to talk to the parents are worried to talk to the teachers because they don't want their child called out. Although we probably could guess that child is having a hard time. Teacher already knows that, kid already knows that, parents already know that. And so that's another thing we just really talk about all the time, especially this time of year coming up on the end of the school year. Like, hey, you talk to your child's teacher, figure out what's going well, what worked, what didn't work, and anything that was working well, let's write that down and let's document that for next year, just to kind of help ease those transitions too, because that can be really tricky for kids with ADHD. Sometimes the new classroom is just enough of a trigger to be like starting all the way over. And so figuring out like what we can carry forward is really another very helpful tool. But send those teachers to us. We're happy to help them and share what we can.
This has been so helpful and informative. And as we wrap up, this is a question we like to ask all of our guests. I would love to hear from each of you how your work in your field has impacted your parenting at home.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I think the beauty of this is that it's transactional. It goes both ways. I think that my professional knowledge and experience informs my parenting, and my experience as a mom to two young, very active, assertive boys informs my work as a professional. So I love that it goes both ways. And so what was the question again about how our professional knowledge informs my own motherhood? Just knowing that there's not one right way to do things. Knowing that there's a lot of ways to accomplish the same goal of raising a confident, happy, independent child. There's not one road to get to that outcome. I think that that's a message that parents need to hear, and having the knowledge that I do, I know that that's true. But I think that parents need to hear that there's not one right way to do all of these things to kind of result in the same outcome of raising a really confident, happy child.
I like it. Am I up next? Well, I think for me, I was a speech pathologist before I became a mom. And I remember having conversations with families like, okay, this is a toddler, right? He's learning how to say more and he's going to sign more, and you're going to cut the bagel into like 93 pieces, and every single little tiny object he's going to sign more. And the parents are kind of looking at me. They have like 4 kids, and the kid is wearing mismatched cowboy boots. And I'm like, really feeling good about this intervention that I have planned. And I think that, when I became a mom, I had really high expectations. I just generally have high expectations of myself, my husband, my everything I do. I'm like, this is going to be great. And I think honestly, for me, I can say that it goes both ways, but being a parent has helped me so much as a professional, because I'm a totally different person. Like now I'm like, okay, just throw the bagel in the back seat and hopefully the child will eat that bagel. I joke, but I think just being more realistic, about, and from the clients that I see and the parents that I support. And then also it makes me really grateful for my kids, and just kind of like seeing as their communication has grown. And I had one child that was an early talker and one child that was a late talker. And that's like really important when you're a speech pathologist. You like document those words. I was the weird mom that brought like a list of syllables to the daycare and was like, these are the consonant vowel structures that she has. And I'm not joking. They somehow let me come back the next day. But I think that you celebrate all of those milestones and you're just so excited to see that. And so for me, I think the two have come together really nicely. And yeah, I do feel empowered. My kids have all kinds of challenges with attention, anxiety, all the things. Bedtimes can be hard, tantrums can be hard. And I do feel like I'm relatively confident to handle them. Although in the moment, as you mentioned, Erin, sometimes I'm like, I'm done with this, but all of that does support, those hard moments too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like similar to Mallory in the sense that I feel like there's no right or wrong way to parent. And I feel like I have 2 different kids, and some strategies that I know like work great with one and not with another. And there's no this works for every child. And I think that in what we do with our online supports is teach parents a lot of different tools, and you can figure out which ones work best for your kids and your family. But I feel like with social media, it's been hard because I get on and I get so much anxiety because I'm like, oh my gosh, I just did this all morning. And they just said I shouldn't be doing this. And I'm a child psychologist, and I feel like I just have had since starting this business, I'm a perfectionist, and realizing that I'm not a perfect parent and I don't need to present myself as a perfect parent. I yelled at my kids this morning and was like, get out of the car, no. And I get frustrated and I lose it and I get angry. And, but I also repair, I can go back to my kids and be like, I lost my temper and I'm really sorry. Do forgive me. And I'm never going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, and we all are going to do that. And if you're listening, that's okay. And don't get caught up in the, you shouldn't do this and you should do this all the time. It's exhausting.
Well, thank you. I think we can all, that resonates with all of us, especially the not perfect parent part. So it's been so nice to speak with you today. And I know folks are going to want to go hear more about you all, see the resources that you've been talking about. Can you just direct them to the best places to find that? And we'll also put them in the show notes.
Yeah, our website is thechildhoodcollective.com, and we have lots of free resources on our website. We have an entire blog with tons of information, and our online course, Creating Calm, is on there, all about parenting ADHD and raising a happy and independent child with ADHD, which I think most parents are really seeking. And then we have our Instagram and Facebook. We just started TikTok. It's totally overwhelming. Don't go over
Don't
there.
look at our TikTok. It's fine. I mean, you could, but you don't need to. It's fine.
I have a teenager and she's mortified at that idea of anything on TikTok.
Right. Instagram is our main place where we spend a lot of time. Daily information, from encouragement to funny, silly reels to trying to educate parents and just relate to their experience. So we'd love for you to follow us and check out all of our free resources too.
Well, thank you. I'm sure everyone will go there. It was a pleasure chatting with you all today.
It was so nice talking with you too.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.